My name is Nora Jean Calloway. I am 31 years old, and my parents did not come when the hospital called them 8 times over 2 days. A stranger paid my bill, $4,712, left his card on the tray table beside my water cup while I was sleeping and was gone before I woke up. I still have the card. It is in the back of a drawer in my kitchen, the one that sticks a little when you pull it. I have moved 3 times since that September and I have never left it behind. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This is where we share real life inspired tales of family conflict, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground. If these stories speak to you, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. I don't know where to start with this, actually. That's the honest thing, because the hospital is not really where the story starts. The hospital is where I finally stopped pretending the story wasn't happening. Let me try to go back. I grew up in Macon, Georgia, not the pretty part. We were off Eisenhower Parkway in a neighborhood where the yards were mostly dirt and the dogs mostly stayed outside. My father worked at a distribution warehouse off I-16 and my mother cleaned houses for a woman named Patris Eldridge on the north side, which was a fact my mother mentioned often and always with a particular tone in her voice that I did not fully understand until I was older. The tone said, "This is beneath me." The work was never beneath her in any real way she could have pointed to, but she felt it was, and that feeling lived in our house like a fourth person. We were not poor in the way people picture when you say poor. We had food, we had cable. My mother had good shoes. But there was a quality to our life that I can only describe now as held together tightly, the way you hold a paper bag with something wet at the bottom, walking fast and hoping. I was the oldest. My brother Devin was 3 years behind me, and my sister Kezia was 7 years behind me, and the way my parents organized their attention, I understood early, was not equal. Devin got the benefit of the doubt. Kezia got the softness. I got the expectation that I already knew what to do and would do it without being asked. This is not a complaint exactly. It made me capable. It made me someone who can look at a broken thing and figure out what it needs before anyone else in the room has identified that it's broken. That has been useful. It has also cost me things I am still counting. I left Macon at 18 on a partial scholarship to Georgia State in Atlanta and a Pell Grant and a third shift job at a Waffle House on North Avenue that I worked for the first 2 years until I could get a lab assistant position on campus that paid $12 an hour and came with slightly more dignity. I studied nursing. I graduated in 2015. I got a job at Grady Memorial and I worked there for 4 years and I was good at it. Genuinely good, not just competent, but the kind of nurse patients ask for by name when they come back. My parents visited my apartment in Atlanta exactly twice in 6 years. Once when I first moved in, when my mother walked through all 4 rooms with her arms crossed slightly and said, "It's small, but it's yours." And once when Devin was in Atlanta for a job interview and they brought him and the three of them took up my living room for a weekend, and my mother cooked in my kitchen and used my good pan to fry fish and left a grease ring on the burner that took me 40 minutes to clean after they left. I called them every Sunday for a while, then every other Sunday. By the time I was 28, I was calling maybe once a month, sometimes less, and they were not calling me. My mother texted occasionally, usually forwards, sometimes a Bible verse, sometimes a photo of Kezia's kids. My father did not text. My father is not a phone person, my mother would say if I asked, which I eventually stopped doing. I want to be precise here because I think people hear my parents weren't there for me and they picture screaming fights, big dramatic moments, slammed doors. That is not what I am describing. What I am describing is something quieter and harder to name. A kind of consistent, low-grade forgetting. Like I was a thing they had once been responsible for and had set down somewhere and occasionally remembered to check on, but mostly had gotten on with things without. I was not estranged from them. We were not enemies. At Christmas, I went home to Macon and sat at the table and ate, and it was fine. Fine is the only word, it was fine. September 2019, I had been having symptoms for 3 weeks that a nurse had been explaining away the way nurses explain away their own symptoms, which is to say badly and with false confidence. Fatigue, a kind of pain in my lower right abdomen that came and went, I told myself it was stress, a pulled muscle, ovarian cysts, everything except what my training was quietly suggesting it might be. On a Wednesday morning, I drove myself to the Grady ER because I could not stand up straight, and the pain had stopped coming and going and was simply there, continuous, a 7 out of 10 that was climbing. They took me back fast. The nurse who triaged me, a woman named Sonia with very short natural hair and a way of moving that communicated she had seen everything twice, looked at my face when I described the pain and said on a scale of 1 to 10, and I said 6, and she said, "Your face says 8, and she was right, it was 8. I had been rounding down from the moment I walked in because I did not want to be difficult. By that afternoon, they had confirmed a ruptured ovarian cyst with complications and a secondary infection that had been going for longer than 3 weeks, probably 6, maybe more. My temperature was 102.4. My white count was elevated. I was being admitted. Here is the thing about being a nurse and being a patient. You know everything that is happening to you, and you also know everything that could happen to you, and the second kind of knowledge is not comforting. I gave them my emergency contacts. My mother was first. My father was second. This was not strategic, it was just the order I had always listed them from some form I had filled out years ago and never updated. They called my mother that Wednesday evening. I was told this by the charge nurse, a man named Gerald who I knew from working that floor, who came in to check on me around 8 p.m. and said, "We reached your mother, she said she'd call back." I nodded. Gerald looked at me for a moment and then looked at the wall behind me and then said, "Do you need anything?" And I said, "I'm okay," and we both understood the entire conversation we were not having. My mother did not call back Wednesday night. Thursday morning, my temperature was 102.9, and I was on IV antibiotics and a pain medication that made the edges of things go slightly soft. And I lay in that bed and I looked at the ceiling, which was a drop ceiling with those foam tiles that have the small, regular holes in them. And I counted the holes in one tile, which took longer than you'd think, and I thought about my mother, who was 49 years old and in good health and owned a car and lived 3 hours from Atlanta on I-75. And I thought about her not calling back. Not calling back and not calling back is different from not being reached. They had reached her, she had said she would call back, she had not. The thought I had in that moment, lying in that bed with the IV in the back of my left hand and the holes in the ceiling tile coming in and out of focus, was this: I am not surprised. That is the thought I am most ashamed of, not because it was wrong, because it was so calm, I had so little surprise in me. Thursday afternoon, they called her again. I know this because Gerald told me and because I could see the notes in my chart on the tablet on my bedside table, because I am a nurse and I knew exactly how to pull up my own chart, which is information most patients don't have and I was glad to have and also not glad to have. She answered. She said she would talk to my father about coming up. She said she didn't know his schedule. I read that in the nursing note and I set the tablet down and I looked at the window, which faced a parking structure, and I watched a man in a gray shirt walk from his car to the elevator and I thought about my father's schedule, which was the same every week and had been the same every week for 15 years. Warehouse Monday through Friday 7 to 3:30 off weekends. He did not have a schedule conflict on a Thursday. My temperature went to 103.1 Thursday night. The resident, a young man named Prakash who could not have been more than 27 and who had the careful manner of someone who had been told his whole life he was too young looking to be trusted, sat with me for 30 minutes Thursday night and explained what was happening in my body in terms that were slightly too simplified for a nurse, but that I understood he was using because he did not yet know I was a nurse. And I let him explain because he was doing it kindly and I did not want to take that from him. He said, "Is there anyone we can call for you?" I said, "They've been calling." He looked at me and then at my chart and then back at me. Something moved across his face that was not pity exactly and not just professional concern exactly. Something in the middle that I have no clean word for. He said, "Is there anyone else?" I thought about it, really thought about it lying there. My closest friend from nursing school was in Portland, Oregon. My neighbor Trish was a possibility, but she had a new baby and I was not going to ask a woman with a 2-month-old to come sit in a hospital. There was a woman I worked with named Candace who I had lunch with sometimes, but I did not think we had reached the level of hospital visits. I had a social life that was full enough in the way a calendar can be full and still have nothing essential written in it. I said, "I'll be okay." Prakash nodded. He said, "We're going to stay on top of this." He meant the infection, the fever, the treatment. He was good at his job and I believed him and I was grateful for that specific thing. He left. The room got quiet again in the particular way hospital rooms get quiet at night, which is not actually quiet at all but is full of distant beeping and rubber-soled footsteps and the ventilation system and the sound of someone down the hall watching television at low volume, all of it becoming a kind of white noise that is intimate and impersonal at the same time. I turned off the light above my bed, not the whole room, just the one above me. I lay in the half-dark and I did something I do not usually do, which is let myself feel exactly what I was feeling without immediately moving to manage it. What I felt was this, a heaviness in my chest that was not cardiac and was not from the infection. A kind of cold, flat sadness that was not new, that I recognized the way you recognize a road you grew up driving, every turn familiar even after years away. I had known this road my whole life. I had just not let myself drive it slowly enough to look at what was on either side. My parents were not coming. Not because they couldn't, not because there was an emergency in their own lives, not because they hadn't been reached. They had been reached multiple times across 2 days, and they were choosing, in whatever quiet way they had been choosing things my whole life, not to come. I fell asleep before 10, the medication helped with that. Friday morning. I woke up to someone in my room who was not a nurse. He was sitting in the chair beside the window, the one with the vinyl seat that the hospital keeps in patient rooms for visitors, and he was reading something on his phone with the screen turned low, and when I moved, he looked up. He was maybe 65, white man, heavy build, thick gray hair, wearing a blue button-down shirt that was clean but not ironed. He had the look of someone who had driven a long distance that morning and had not stopped to eat. He said, "I'm sorry to wake you, I'm in the wrong rooms." His voice was unhurried, not an apology voice, just a statement of fact. I said it's okay. He didn't move immediately. He looked around the room briefly, the way people do when they're trying to figure out where they are, and his eyes passed over the IV stand and the monitor and my chart tablet on the table and the single flower no one had brought, because there was no flower, just the plastic water pitcher and the cup with the bendy straw. He said, "You have somebody coming." I said, "I'm fine." He looked at me for a moment, not with pity, more like he was reading a sign from a little too far away. He said, "I'll get out of your hair." He stood up. He was looking for something in the room, some door that would make sense, and I could see him realizing he had turned himself around somewhere in the hallway and ended up one room from where he meant to be. He had that particular look of a person who is not used to being disoriented and is not panicking about it but is taking stock. He said, "My wife's in 412. I said, "I think you want to go right out the door." He said, "Thank you." He left. That was all. That was the whole first conversation. I am telling you this slowly because I want you to understand that there was nothing about it that should have mattered. A man in the wrong room, a small exchange, nothing. But I thought about it all Friday mornings. I thought about the way he had asked, "You have somebody coming," not as a conversational filler, but like he actually wanted to know, like it was information that meant something to him. And I thought about the fact that he was in this hospital, sitting beside a vinyl chair at whatever time it had been because his wife was in room 412 and he was there because she was there. It was that simple. It did not require explanation or scheduling or coordination. She was there, and so he was there. My temperature was 102.5 on Friday morning, which was down from 103.1 and was the right direction but was still a fever and still required monitoring and still meant I was not going anywhere. Gerald came in around 9 and said, "We tried your folks again this morning." I said, "I know." He said, "Your mother said she might come Saturday." I said, "Okay." He said, "You need anything?" And I said, "I'm good." And he said, "I know you're a nurse, Nora, but you're the patient right now." And that is what he said, and what he meant was you are allowed to not be fine and tell us what you need. I understood what he meant. I said I was good. He left. I did not need anything they could provide. What I needed was not available in this building and was not going to come from Macon. I called Devin Friday afternoon, not because I expected much, but because I wanted to hear a voice that knew me from before. Devin answered on the third ring. He was at work at his accounting firm in Savannah, and I could hear the office sounds behind him. I said, "Hey," I said, "I'm in the hospital. It's nothing critical. I just wanted to let you know." He said, "Oh damn." He said, "What happened?" I told him briefly. He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yes, mostly. The fever is coming down." He said, "Do mom and dad know?" And I said, "Yes, they know." And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Okay, well, I'm glad it's not critical." He said, "Keep me posted." He did not say he would come. He did not ask what hospital. He did not ask when I was getting out. He said, "Keep me posted," and then we were wrapping up and I let us wrap up. After I hung up, I held the phone on my chest for a while. The phone was warm from the call. My chest was warm from the fever. Outside the window, the sky was going from white to gray the way it does in Atlanta in September, not a dramatic sky, just a sky that has used itself up for the day. I circled a date on a calendar once, the day I moved to Atlanta for college. I drew a small star next to it. August 22, 2010. I thought I was marking a beginning. I did not know I was also marking an end, the end of some period in which I had still been waiting to be seen the way I could see myself, waiting for that confirmation to come from the people who had known me longest. That confirmation was never coming. I know that now. I think I knew it lying in that hospital bed. I had known it for a long time, I just had not been still enough to know that I knew it. Friday evening, maybe 6:30, the man in the blue shirt came back. He knocked on the open door. He said, "I wanted to check on you." I said, "You don't have to do that." He said, "I know." He came in anyway. He pulled the vinyl chair closer to the bed, not too close, a respectful distance, and he sat down and he said, "How are you doing?" I said, "Fever's down, antibiotics are working." He said, "That's the clinical answer." I looked at him. He was looking back at me with that same reading a sign expression. Patient and unhurried. I said, "I'm okay." He said, "I'm Malcolm." I said, "Nora." He said his wife's name was Patricia and she had been in this hospital for 11 days, and before that she had been in a hospital in Decatur for 9 days, and before that they had been driving from Memphis, which is where they lived, and none of this had been planned. He said it plainly, the way you'd give directions. No editorializing, just the shape of what had happened. I said, "I'm sorry." He said, "She's going to be all right." Then he was quiet for a moment and he looked at the window and he said, "I think she's going to be all right." And I heard the difference between those two sentences and I did not point it out because there was no need to. We talked for maybe 45 minutes. He asked about my job and I told him about nursing, and he asked specific questions, not polite questions but actual questions. And I found myself talking about Grady in a way I hadn't talked about it in a while, the way you talk about something you actually love when someone actually asks. He told me he ran a small company in Memphis that did commercial HVAC, had run it for 30 years, had started it with $11,000 and a truck that broke down more than it ran. He said it like it was a funny story now, even though it clearly hadn't been. He did not ask me who was coming to see me. He had already asked that and I had already answered, and he did not make me answer again. When he stood up to leave, he said, "You eat today." I said, "Hospital food." He said, "I'll be back." I said, "Malcolm, you don't need to do that." He said, "Patricia's asleep by 8 and I have nowhere to be." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He said, "Is there anything specific you want or should I just figure it out?" I said, "Anything is fine." He left and came back at 8:15 with a bag from a Jamaican place on Ponce de Leon that I knew well, jerk chicken and rice and peas and a piece of hard bread. He pulled the tray table over, the rolling one on the arm, and he set the food on it, and he went and sat in the chair by the window and he read his phone while I ate, and he did not make the eating into a moment or a gesture or a thing I had to respond to. He just let me eat. When I was done, he said, "Better." I said, "Yes." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I'll come by tomorrow." He did. Saturday morning, my mother texted. She said she and my father were going to try to come that afternoon. I read the text and I read it again and then I set my phone down. Try to come? They were going to try to come. I was 212 miles away in a hospital with a fever that had been running for 3 days and they were going to try. I did not respond to the text right away. I lay there and I breathed and I thought about what I wanted to say, and I decided I did not want to say anything yet. Malcolm came by at 10 with coffee and a thing of yogurt and granola from a place across the street. He sat in the chair and we talked. His daughter lived in Charlotte and called every day and had offered to come, and he had told her no, that he had it handled. He said this without pride, just as a fact. He said Patricia would not have wanted the disruption. The daughter was 7 months pregnant. It was not the time. I said, "Does Patricia know you've been spending time with the strange woman in the wrong room?" He said, "I told her this morning." He said, "She said give you her regards." I said, "She sounds like a good woman." He said, "She is the best person I have ever known." He said it simply, no performance in it, just the steady truth of it, the way you'd state a geographic fact. Something in my throat went tight. I turned and looked at the window, the parking structure again. The man in the gray shirt was not there this time, a woman with a stroller, a teenager with headphones, the ordinary traffic of people whose lives were continuing. Malcolm did not acknowledge that my throat had gone tight. He just kept talking, something about an HVAC job in Birmingham that had gone badly, a story that was apparently funny, and by the time he reached the end, I was back. Saturday afternoon, my parents came. My mother first, through the door with that particular way of moving she has, purposeful and slightly performative at the same time, like she is always aware of being watched. She was wearing a blue dress and her good earrings, and she had clearly stopped to fix her hair. I noticed this and filed it away. You don't put on your good earrings for a hospital visit unless the hospital visit is partly a performance. My father behind her, in his good pants and a polo shirt, looking at the floor in that way he has of being in a room without quite being in a room. My mother said, "Nora, baby, how are you feeling?" She came to the bed and took my hand and squeezed it and looked at my face. With an expression of concern that was real, I believe it was real, but was also sized slightly too large for the room, the way you'd perform concern for someone watching from the back row. I said, "I'm better, the fever is down." She said, "We got here as fast as we could." I looked at her, I did not say anything. The thought I was having was, you got here on Saturday, they called you Wednesday night. There is a version of as fast as we could that covers 68 hours and a version that does not. But I did not say this. I held her hand and I said, "I know." My father pulled up the second chair, the regular chair, not the vinyl visitor one, and sat down with his elbows on his knees. He said, "They treating you all right in here?" I said yes. He said, "Good." He looked at the IV stand and then at the window. My mother started talking. She talked about the drive, which had taken them almost 4 hours because of construction on I-75, and about Kezia's youngest who had a cold, and about a situation at the church that I did not follow, and she talked with her hand still holding mine, and I let her talk because I understood this was how she managed things, by filling the air, by making the silence into something that could not ask questions. My father did not talk. My father was there in his body and somewhere else in every other way. At some point, maybe 40 minutes in, my mother got up to use the restroom and my father and I were alone in the room. He looked at me, he said, "You doing okay?" I said, "I will be." He nodded, he looked at the IV again, he said, "You should have called." I said, "They called you twice on Wednesday, twice on Thursday, Friday morning." He was quiet, he put his hands together between his knees, he did not look at me. I said, "You knew." He said, "Your mother was worried about the drive." I said, "Okay." He said, "She worries, you know how she is." I said, "I know how she is." And then I stopped talking because anything else I said was going to be something I could not unsay, and I was in a hospital bed with a fever and an IV, and I did not have the reserves for it. I lay back against the pillow and I looked at the ceiling, the drop tiles with the holes, and I counted holes for a moment the way I had on Thursday, and I breathed. My father sat in that chair and said nothing, and I lay in that bed and said nothing, and the ventilation hummed, and somewhere down the hall a monitor beeped, and that was us, that was the two of us, that was the whole 31 years. My mother came back from the restroom and resumed talking. She stayed 3 hours, they left around 6. My mother hugged me carefully, mindful of the IV, and said she would call tomorrow and they'd figure out a time to come back. My father patted my shoulder and said, "Take care." They left. I lay there. The room felt exactly as empty as it had before they came. That is the precise truth of it. 3 hours of their presence and the room was the same room. Tell me, have you ever had someone show up when you needed them and still felt completely alone? Have you ever understood in some final, documented way that the people who should see you never will? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because what happens next is the part I've been building toward this whole time. Malcolm came at 8:15. He knocked and came in and said, "You have company tonight." He had seen the chairs rearranged, maybe, or just sensed it. I said, "My parents came." He said, "Good." I said, "Yeah." He looked at me, he sat down, he said, "How was it?" I said, "It was fine." He said, "Fine." I said, "Fine is the right word." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Patricia and I had a period early in our marriage when her parents were still alive, when fine was what everything was. Every visit fine, every holiday fine." He picked up his coffee cup, the disposable one from the lobby, turned it slightly in his hands. He said, "It takes a lot out of you, fine does, more than people think." I said, "Yes." He said, "You don't have to explain it to me." I said, "I know." We sat there, the two of us, in the quiet hospital room with the parking structure outside and the drop ceiling above and the IV dripping whatever it was dripping into the back of my left hand, and it was the least alone I had felt in 4 days. Sunday my fever broke. Not dramatically, just a morning check at 98.6 where it had been 99.4 the night before. Prakash came in, looked at the numbers, said, "I think we're turning a corner." He said they would probably discharge me Monday or Tuesday depending on the next day's labs. I called Devin and told him I was getting out soon. He said, "Great, glad you're better." That was the call. I did not call my mother. I told myself I would call later. Later became that night. That night I told myself I would call tomorrow. I did not examine this too closely. Monday morning, Malcolm came at 9 instead of 10. He sat down and said Patricia was being discharged Wednesday. He said it with a quiet relief that was enormous but contained, the way you describe surviving something. I said, "That is really good news." He said, "Yes, it is." He said, "I have something I want to ask you, and I want you to feel completely free to say no." I said, "Okay." He said, "My company does a scholarship every year, $10,000 for anyone in a healthcare field going back to school or doing advanced training." He said, "Patricia started it 15 years ago in honor of a nurse who took care of her mother." He said, "Every year we pick someone, and every year it is a little bit of a process, and I wonder if you have thought about any advanced training you have been putting off." My throat closed. I had been putting off one thing for 2 years, a nurse practitioner program at Emory. The application was on my laptop at home, half finished, because the cost had seemed like a wall I couldn't see over, $42,000 for the program plus lost income during the clinical hours. I said, "Malcolm." He said, "This is not the whole thing, I know. But it is a start." He said, "I have seen you these 4 days, the way you talked to the nurses about your own care, the way you tracked your own chart." He said, "You are very good at what you do and you should be doing more of it, and something should not be stopping you because of money when there are people like me who have more of it than we have good uses for." I said, "I don't know what to say." He said, "You don't have to say anything today, think about it." I was discharged Tuesday morning. The billing office gave me my statement on the way out. The total was $4,712 after insurance. This was after what my insurance covered. This was my share. I stood at the discharge desk with the paper in my hand and I did something I was not expecting to do, which was to just stand there very still for a moment. Not dramatically, just still. The billing coordinator, a young woman named Shannon with neat braids and a lanyard with sunflowers on it, said, "We can do a payment plan," and I said, "I know," and I said, "I just need a minute." She gave me a minute. I went back to my room to get my bag. The room was empty, cleaned for the next patient, stripped down. To the institutional basics, the vinyl chair was pushed back against the wall, the rolling tray table was returned to its position by the bed, the drop ceiling with the holes was the same ceiling. On the tray table was a small card. Plain white business card, Malcolm Dewberry, Dewberry Climate Systems, Memphis, Tennessee, a phone number and email. And on the back in his handwriting, the kind of handwriting that is careful but not fancy, he had written, "The scholarship application is at our website. Tell Patricia I hope you apply." And underneath that he had written, "The bill is handled." I stood there with the card in my hand. "The bill is handled." 4 sentences on the back of a business card. "The bill is handled." I sat down in the vinyl chair for a minute, not crying. I want to be accurate about that. What I felt was not the feeling you get when you cry, not the pressure and release of it, but something quieter and stranger. A kind of sudden weight reduction, like when your ears pop on an airplane and you realize the pressure had been there the whole time. A stranger had done this. A man who had walked into my room by accident, who was there because he loved his wife enough to sit in a hospital chair for 11 days, who had asked about my food and brought jerk chicken and listened to me talk about nursing, had paid $4,712 of my medical bill and left a card on a tray table while I was sleeping. I thought about my parents, who had known I was here for 3 days before they came. I thought about Devin, who had said keep me posted. I thought about everyone who had been reachable and had remained comfortably out of reach, and I thought about this man who had been in the wrong room, who had no obligation, who owed me nothing, who had sat in the vinyl chair and said, "You have somebody coming." I took the card and I put it in my bags. I applied to the Emory NP program 6 weeks later. The application I had left half finished for 2 years. I completed it in one evening, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold because I was not paying attention to it. I submitted it at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. I was accepted in January 2020. I enrolled in the spring cohort. Malcolm and Patricia came to Atlanta once that spring before everything changed with the world. Patricia was a small, precise woman with Patricia's eyes, which is to say Malcolm's description of her as the best person he'd ever known immediately made sense when you looked at her. She had a way of paying attention to you that made you feel like the room had gotten slightly quieter, like she was clearing space specifically to hear you. We had lunch at a place in Decatur, the four of us, meaning me and Malcolm and Patricia and Candace from work who I had by then gotten to the level of hospital visits with and beyond. Patricia and I talked for a long time about the scholarship and about nursing and about what I wanted to do with the NP credential, and she told me about the nurse who had cared for her mother, a woman named Ruth at Piedmont Hospital in 1998, who had held her mother's hand during a hard night and said, "You're not going to do this alone, I am right here." Patricia said, "I have been trying to pay that back ever since." I said, "You have." She reached across the table and put her hand on mine, briefly, the way you'd touch a door you were grateful to find open. I finished the NP program in 2022. I am now a family nurse practitioner at a community health clinic in East Point, Georgia, which is southwest of Atlanta, which is where the people are who need it most. My starting salary was $78,000, which is not a fortune, but it is a floor I built myself and it does not shake. I called my mother the week I got the job. She said, "Oh, that's good, Nora." She said, "Devin just got promoted, did I tell you?" I said she hadn't. She told me about Devin's promotion for 5 minutes and then she said she had to go because dinner was almost ready. I sat with the phone after we hung up. The phone was on the table and I was looking at it and I was not hurt exactly. The hurt had been there for so long it had become furniture. I knew where it was in every room. I just didn't have to keep looking at it. The card is in the kitchen drawer, the one that sticks. Every time I pull it open for a pen or a rubber band or whatever I need, I see it. Malcolm Dewberry, Memphis, Tennessee, the bill is handled. I think about the moment he walked into my room. "Wrong room," he said. And he sat in the chair and he read his phone, and when I woke up, he apologized for disturbing me. He had no reason to come back. He had a wife in the hospital. He had enough to carry. He came back anyway because she was asleep by 8 and he had nowhere to be, and because some people, when they see someone in a room alone with no flour on the table, decide that is their business. My parents know me. They have my number saved in their phones. They know the year I was born and my middle name and the church where I was baptized. They know everything about me except how to choose me when choosing would cost them something. Malcolm did not know my middle name. He did not know what year I was born. He knew I was in a hospital room without company and that I had said I was fine, and he knew that fine was not the whole story, and he came back. There is something I want to say about this that I am going to try to say correctly. I do not believe my parents are bad people. I have thought about this carefully across many years, and that is my conclusion. They are not bad people. They are people who have a limited amount of what I needed, the specific kind of presence and attention that I needed, and they have always had a limited amount of it, and they have distributed what they had according to patterns that were set before I was old enough to name them. Devin got more of it. Kezia got more of it. I was the capable one, the one who did not need it, or seemed not to, and over time that seeming became their story about me, and eventually it became such a complete story that even a hospital call could not fully interrupt it. This is not forgiveness, I want to be clear. I am not standing here 31 years later with a lesson about forgiveness and growth and moving forward. I am standing here with a card in a kitchen drawer and a job I love and a life I built largely without them, and what I feel when I think about my parents is something that is not forgiveness and not bitterness. Something more like a very quiet, very old grief that I have learned to carry without it taking up my whole body. What Malcolm and Patricia gave me is not replaceable and is not transferable. It is not something I can pass on by being generous to strangers, though I try to be. It is a specific thing that happened in a specific room in September 2019, a man in the wrong room who asked the right question and came back the next day and the day after that and the day after that and paid a bill he didn't owe because some people, when they see a person who needs something, they just do the thing. I am a nurse practitioner now. When I am with patients who are alone, when I see that no one has come, I think about Sonia at the triage desk saying your face says 8 when I said 6. I think about Gerald saying you are the patient right now. I think about Prakash's 30-minute explanation and his asking, is there anyone else? I stay a little longer, I ask the second question, I let them not be fine. Ruth at Piedmont Hospital in 1998 told Patricia's mother, "You are not going to do this alone, I am right here." Patricia told Malcolm. Malcolm told me, "I am trying to tell it forward into every room I walk into." The card is in the drawer. Every time I open it, I know the bill is handled. There is something else I have not said yet, and I want to say it now because I think it is the part that took me the longest to understand. The months after the hospital, the fall of 2019, I went back to work and I went back to my apartment on Ponce de Leon. Not the same street as the Jamaican restaurant Malcolm had gotten food from, but close enough that I walked past it sometimes and thought about the styrofoam container and the jerk chicken, and the way he had just sat in the vinyl chair and read his phone while I ate. I went back to work and I was fine, clinically fine. The infection had cleared. My energy came back by the second week. I worked my shifts and charted my notes and answered doctors' questions and pushed IV poles down corridors and did all the things I knew how to do, and from the outside, nothing had changed. But something had rearranged inside me during those 4 days in September, and I was still figuring out the new layout. I had a notebook that fall, one of those black hardback ones, the moleskine kind that are a little overpriced but feel good to write in. I started carrying it in October. I had not kept a journal since college, but I started writing in this one, not every day, sometimes every few days, sometimes less. I wrote about work, I wrote about patience. I wrote about small things, a tree on my street that was the last to turn color, a song that played in the grocery store checkout that I did not know the name of but that put a particular kind of ache in my chest. I wrote about my family in small, careful pieces, the way you take apart something that is still slightly warm. I wrote about a Thanksgiving in 2012 when I had driven back to Macon from Atlanta for the holiday, my second year of college, and I had brought a sweet potato pie I had made from scratch in my apartment, the first time I had ever made one. And it was good, it was actually good. I had eaten a slice while it was still warm from the oven, and it had the right texture and the right spice, and I had been quietly proud of it in the way you are proud of a first thing done well. My mother set it on the counter when I brought it in and did not mention it during dinner. After dinner, Devin's girlfriend at the time, a woman named Alexis, said, "Who made the sweet potato pie?" And my mother said, "Nora made that." And Alexis said it was delicious, and my mother said she made it from a mix, and I was at the kitchen sink washing a pot and I stopped washing the pot. I had not made it from a mix. I had made it from scratch, from a recipe I had looked up, using real sweet potatoes that I had baked and mashed with butter and eggs and evaporated milk and a precise amount of nutmeg. I had made it from scratch, and my mother, without any reason, with nothing to gain, said I had made it from a mix. I stood at the sink and I held the pot and I thought very clearly, why did you say that? I did not say it out loud. I set the pot down and I dried my hands and I went back to the table and the conversation moved on and nobody knew. But I wrote about it in the notebook in October 2019, 7 years later, and as I was writing it, I was aware that I had held on to it for 7 years, that I had cataloged it with all the other small moments I had cataloged. The way my mother had answered for me at family gatherings, had described me to people in ways that were slightly off, had reduced things I had done or made them someone else's doing, quietly, consistently, without drama or cruelty, just a steady, gentle erasure of my particular shape. I want to say something careful here. My mother loved me, I believe that. Love and the steady, gentle erasure of your particular shape are not mutually exclusive. I know that now in a way I did not at 18 or 22 or 26. You can love someone and also, without intending harm, flatten them. You can love someone and also be so convinced of the story you have of them that you cannot receive new information that doesn't fit. You can love someone and still not come when the hospital calls. I circled the date October 14, 2019 in the notebook, next to a paragraph about the sweet potato pie. I don't know why I circled it. Sometimes I circled things just to mark them. My mother and I talked on the phone that fall are once a month. Calls, and they were what they always were. She talked about Devon and Kezia and the church and Patris Eldridge for whom she still cleaned on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I listened and offered sounds of interest and occasionally asked a question and got an answer and we hung up and I sat with the phone. I did not talk about the scholarship. I did not tell her about Malcolm or Patricia or the Emory application. I held those things privately in the way I had always held my private things because I had learned early that the private things I offered to my mother had a way of being redirected, summarized, attributed elsewhere. The sweet potato pie made from a mix. I held the scholarship privately. The Emory application was its own thing. I have said I completed it in one evening, but that is not quite accurate. I had half completed it 2 years earlier in the fall of 2017, and then I had stopped because the financial portion had laid out what I was looking at and the number had seemed like something I could not navigate from where I stood, and I had told myself I would come back to it and I had not. What changed in October 2019 was not the money exactly. The scholarship changed the math, but it was not only the math. What changed was something else, something harder to name. Something about lying in that hospital bed and watching the ceiling and understanding that the confirmation I had been waiting for was not coming. The confirmation from my parents that I was worth the drive, worth the schedule adjustment, worth the inconvenience, and that I had been waiting for it for years, quietly, without fully knowing I was waiting. And the waiting had been taking up space in me that could be used for other things. I stopped waiting in September 2019. I did not decide to stop, I just found that I had. When I completed the application in October, I was not doing it to prove anything to anyone. I was doing it because I had a laptop and a cup of tea and a Tuesday evening and a half-finished application, and the reason I had left it half-finished was no longer there. The acceptance letter came in January. I was at work when the email arrived. I was in the break room eating a sandwich and my phone lit up with the Emory notification, and I opened it and I read the first line, and then I sat there in the break room with the sandwich in my hand and I read it again. Candace came in and said, "What?" And I held up my phone. And she said, "Oh my God," and she came over and hugged me with the kind of enthusiasm that knocks you slightly sideways. And I held the phone and let myself be knocked sideways for a moment, and then I finished my sandwich and went back to work. I texted Malcolm. He responded within 5 minutes with 3 words, "Knew you would." Patricia texted 20 minutes later with a longer message that I will not reproduce here because it is mine, but it was the kind of message that you save and go back to. I told Candace and Gerald and a few other people at work. I did not tell my mother until February, a full month later, during our monthly call. Almost as an aside, I got accepted into the NP program at Emory. I'll be starting in the spring. She said, "Oh, that is good." She said, "That is a big school." She said, "How much does that cost?" And I said, "I have some help with the funding." And she said, "Well, good, you should have started that a long time ago." And she moved on to something about Devon. I held the phone after and I breathed. I was not surprised, I want to note that. The thing I felt in my body was not surprise. It was a kind of settling, like when you press something into place and it clicks and then that's where it lives, that's the shape of it, now you know. The program started in March 2020, which was a remarkable time to start anything, and a lot of it moved online. And there were weeks when everything felt provisional and uncertain in the large world historical way as well as in my personal small way. And I sat in my apartment and did coursework and watched the news and checked on patients by telehealth and thought about Ruth at Piedmont in 1998 and Patricia's mother and Malcolm in the vinyl chair. I want to tell you about one more thing from those 4 days in the hospital that I have been circling around. On Sunday, the day before I was discharged, Patricia came to see me herself. Malcolm had mentioned she might. She had been moved to a step-down unit and was feeling better and wanted to meet the woman from the wrong room, which is how Malcolm had described me to her. She came in Sunday afternoon, moving carefully the way you move when your body has recently been through something, and she pulled the vinyl chair up to my bed and she sat down. She was small, as I have said, clear brown eyes, silver natural hair kept close to her head. She was wearing her own clothes, which meant she was close to going home, a blue robe over a regular sweater. She said, "Malcolm talks about you like he's known you 30 years. I said, "He came and sat with me when I needed someone to sit." She said, "He does that." She said, "When we were first married, I used to think it was too much. You know, he'd taken every stray situation he came across." And she said, "I was wrong about that. It is not too much. It is exactly right." I said, "You started the scholarship." She said, "I did." I said, "Because of Ruth." She said, "Because of Ruth." She smoothed the edge of her robe. She said, "A nurse held my mother's hand all night the night she died, and she did not have to do that. She had other patients. The shift was hard. She did not have to do that, and she did it anyway, and my mother was not alone." I said she wasn't. Patricia said I could not bring Ruth back. I could not go back to 1998 and tell her what she gave us. So I tried to pay it forward the way people say. She said, "You pay it forward and then the person you paid it to pays it forward, and after a while the thread is long enough that it goes places you can never trace." She looked at me steadily. She said, "You are going to pay it forward." It was not a question. I said yes. She reached over and touched my hand briefly, the way I have described, and then she stood up carefully and she adjusted her robe and she said, "I am very glad my husband walked into the wrong room." I said, "So am I." She went back to her room. I sat in my bed and looked at the parking structure. The man in the gray shirt was not there. The woman with the stroller was not there. Just the ordinary structure, the concrete levels, the cars in their spaces going nowhere. I had been in this room for 5 days. I would leave it tomorrow. I would go back to my apartment, back to my shifts, back to my life, which was my life and which was mine. My parents had been here for 3 hours out of 5 days. A stranger had been here every night. I was 31 years old. I was a nurse. I had a fever that had broken and an IV that would come out tomorrow and a business card in my bag from a man in Memphis and an application sitting half finished on my laptop that I was going to finish. I thought about the notebook I would start in October. I thought about circling the date October 14. I thought about the sweet potato pie from 2012 and my mother saying I made it from a mix and me standing at the sink with the pot in my hands not saying anything. 7 years of not saying anything. 7 years of waiting for the confirmation that was not coming. I lay back against the pillow. The light was going in the way September light goes, early and golden, making the parking structure look briefly like something it wasn't. I closed my eyes. I thought about Patricia's thread, the one she could no longer trace, going from Ruth in 1998 forward and forward through people she would never know, and I thought about where I was on the thread, and I thought about Malcolm in the wrong room, and I thought about Sonia at triage who had said your face says 8, and Gerald who had said you are the patient right now, and Prakash and his 30-minute explanation. And all the people in that building who had done the thing without needing a reason beyond that I needed it. I have been a nurse practitioner for 3 years now, in East Point. The community health clinic where I work sees patients who are uninsured or underinsured, patients who have put things off because they could not afford to address them, patients who come in with things that would have been manageable a year ago. I see them and I do what I can do. I stay late sometimes. I sit in the room longer than the schedule recommends. Somebody asked me once at a clinic fundraiser, why East Point, why this population, why not go somewhere with better pay and easier cases? I thought about how to answer. I said because this is where the thread led. They looked at me like I had said something obscure. I didn't explain further. Some things you carry and some things you explain and some things you just do. The card is in the drawer. Malcolm Dewberry. The bill is handled. I pull that drawer open sometimes late at night looking for a pen and I see it there and I hold it for a moment, the small white card, and I feel the weight of what it represents. Not just the money. The money was a gesture, but it was not the thing. The thing was the vinyl chair. The thing was the question he asked when I woke up and found him in my room. The thing was him coming back. The thing was him sitting there while I ate from a styrofoam container and not making it into anything, just letting it be what it was. You have somebody coming. He asked that question and I said I was fine, and he accepted that answer and came back anyway. My parents had my phone number and my hospital room number and 3 days of not coming, and they came for 3 hours and left, and my mother adjusted her earrings twice during the visit, and my father looked at the wall, and that is the whole story of that. A stranger pulled a chair up to my bed and said, "What do you want?" and went and got it. I have thought a great deal about what to make of this discrepancy. I have thought about it in the notebook. I have thought about it driving I-285 at 6 in the morning, the Atlanta skyline appearing and disappearing in the gaps between buildings. I have thought about it in the clinic, walking between exam rooms, in the quarter-second pauses between patient encounters. What I have come to is this: the people who should love you and the people who actually show up are not always the same people. This is not a tragedy. It is just a fact, the way certain facts are, the way weather is, the way the drop ceiling has those small regular holes. It is a fact and you can spend your life grieving it, or you can find the people who show up and let them matter. My parents are still my parents. I call my mother most months. I went home for Christmas last year and ate at the table and it was fine. My father is quieter now, aging into his silence, and sometimes I sit beside him and we watch a game and say very little, and it is, in its way, a form of peace. Not the form I would have chosen, the form that exists. Devin got promoted again. Kezia's kids are in school now. Patricia had a small health event last spring, nothing serious, a few days in a Memphis hospital, and Malcolm sent me a text from the waiting room that said just sitting in my chair. I texted back, I know how that goes. He sent a laughing emoji, then a heart. I made a sweet potato pie last Thanksgiving, made it from scratch. I ate it at my own table with Candace and her boyfriend and two nurses from the clinic and a patient who had nowhere to go for the holiday. I made it with real sweet potatoes and butter and eggs and evaporated milk and the right amount of nutmeg. It was good. I took a photo of it before we cut it. I did not send the photo to my mother, I held it. Some things you make for yourself. Some things you carry and some things you explain and some things you make and you hold the photo and you know what it is. The card is in the drawer. I want to go back to Wednesday, the first night, before Malcolm, before the visits, before any of it. They admitted me at 3:17 in the afternoon. I remember the time because I looked at the clock on the wall in the intake room when they were doing my paperwork. One of those institutional clocks with the big white face and the black hands, the kind that moves in small distinct jumps rather than sweeping, and I thought 3:17 and I noted it the way I note specific things when I am afraid, which is a habit I developed so long ago I don't remember developing it. My room was on the fourth floor. The elevator opened to a hallway that I knew from working it, that I had walked dozens of times from the other side, pushing carts and carrying charts and answering call lights, and now I was being walked down it in a gown with an IV pole that I was already steering myself because the tech pushing me had offered and I had said I've got it. The room was 407, I know the number. I have thought about the fact that Malcolm's wife was in 412 and he turned himself around in that hallway and ended up 5 rooms the wrong direction. 5 rooms. If she had been in 408 or 409, he might have opened my door and realized his mistake before he sat down. If she had been in 420, he would have turned the other way and never come near me. 5 rooms. I do not believe in things happening for reasons, particularly. I am a medical professional. I know how bodies work and I know how chance works, and I know that the story we tell about why things happen the way they did is almost always a story we make after the fact, a pattern we draw on what was actually just weather. But I do think about those 5 rooms sometimes. I was in the bed by 4 o'clock. The nurse who got me settled was a young woman named Brianna who was in her first year on the floor. I could tell by the way she double-checked the IV placement twice and confirmed my allergies in slightly more detail than was strictly necessary. She was careful. Careful is good. I told her I was a nurse and she said, I thought you looked familiar, and then she said, I'm sorry, and I said, don't be sorry, it is what it is, and I meant it. She dimmed the lights before she left and said, call light is on the right side. I said, I know. She smiled and went out. I was alone. The room was not dark, there was enough ambient light from the window and the equipment, but it was dim enough that the ceiling tiles had lost their detail and were just a gray plane above me. I could hear the IV dripping. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear the hallway sounds, the particular frequencies of a hospital in early evening, cartwheels and conversation and a distant television, and the efficient footsteps of people who have somewhere to be and know how to get there. I had been having the pain for 3 weeks. I want to say again because it matters, I had been having the pain and I had been cataloging it and explaining it and minimizing it the way nurses minimize their own symptoms, which is a form of cowardice dressed as competence. I knew on some level by the second week that something was wrong in a way that my explanations did not quite cover. I knew, I kept going to work. The morning I could not stand up straight was a Wednesday. I remember that I had an overnight shift Tuesday into Wednesday and I had gone home at 7:30 a.m. and tried to sleep, but the pain was different, not the intermittent thing it had been, just there, a presence, a persistent 7 that climbed to 8 by 10 a.m., and I lay in my own bed in my own apartment and I thought, okay, you have to go. I drove myself. I live 8 minutes from Grady. I drove 8 minutes and parked in the garage and walked to the ER entrance and checked in and said I work here and I have abdominal pain, and the nurse at the desk looked at my face and moved me through. My emergency contacts were from a form I had filled out in 2016. My mother first, my father second. I had never updated them. I don't know why I had never updated them, except that updating emergency contacts requires you to think about who you would call in an emergency, and for a long time I had not let myself think about that directly, I had just let the default sit. The default was my parents, who did not come. I thought about this a lot those first 2 days, about the form I filled out in 2016, about why I had chosen them, what I had been thinking, whether I had been thinking anything at all, or just writing the closest family names in the available boxes. I think I had been hoping, that is the honest answer. I think in 2016 I had still been, on some quiet, unexamined level, hoping that the family I had would become something different than it was, that some circumstance would arise that would reveal a different version of them, a version that chose me the way I needed to be chosen. Lying in that bed Wednesday night, I was 31 years old and I was done hoping. Not dramatically, not with anger or grief or any of the large emotions people have in movies when they reach the end of something. Just done the way you are done with a cup of coffee that has gone cold, not sad about it, just finished. I did not update my emergency contacts until the following year. When I updated them, I put Malcolm and Patricia. I called Malcolm first to ask, and he said, of course, and I could hear him sitting somewhere in his house in Memphis, and I thought about him in the vinyl chair, and I thought, yes, of course. And I thanked him, and we talked for a while about nothing in particular, the way people do when they are comfortable together. The emergency contacts on my form now are Malcolm Dewberry and Patricia Dewberry, Memphis, Tennessee. Candace Whitmore is third. My mother is not on the form. This is not a punishment, I want to say that clearly. It is not something I did to hurt my mother or to make a statement. It is just an accurate reflection of who would come. That is all an emergency contact is. The person who will come. I had been putting my parents' names on that form for years while understanding, somewhere beneath the understanding I admitted to myself, that they would not come. And in September 2019, they confirmed what I had known, and in October 2019, I started the notebook, and in November 2019, I updated my contacts. The form now reflects reality, that is all. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with my father, not the one in the hospital room, the one where he said your mother was worried about the drive and I said I know, a different one, earlier. This was Thanksgiving 2017. I was 29. I was back in Macon and it was the evening after the food, after the dishes, and most of the family had gone and it was just my parents and me, which was unusual. There was usually someone else around, Devin or Kezia or church people. My mother had gone to bed early with a headache and it was just my father and me in the living room, and he was watching a game I did not care about and I was on my phone, and at some point I put the phone down and I said, Dad. He said, yeah. I said, do you know I have been at Grady for 4 years? He said, yeah, I know that. I said, I've been thinking about going back to school, the nurse practitioner program. I said it like it was a casual thought, which it wasn't. I had been thinking about it for months. He said, how long is that? I said 2 years part-time. He was quiet for a moment, watching the game. Then he said, that's a good idea. He said it the way you'd confirm a fact, not with enthusiasm, not with anything that would remember itself later as support, just that's a good idea, like I had asked him to confirm something. I said, do you think so? He said, you're good at your work, you always were good at whatever you did. This is the most he has ever said to me about my work in my entire life. I want to note that. You always were good at whatever you did. Said during a commercial break on a Tuesday evening in November 2017 without looking away from the television. I said, thank you, Dad. He said, That was it, the commercial ended, the game came back, I picked up my phone. I have written about this in the notebook, I have turned it over, I have tried to receive it in the most generous possible way, which is, he said something true about me, you always were good at whatever you did. He said something true in the way he knows how, which is briefly and without looking at you and during a commercial. I receive it, I hold it, it is the most he could do and he did it. And also, it was not enough. Those two things are both true and they will always be both true, and I have made my peace with holding them together. The tree on my street that was the last to turn color in October 2019, I wrote about it in the notebook. It was a sweet gum tree. I looked it up because I did not know what kind it was, a big one, the kind with the spiky seed pods that make a mess of the sidewalk. In October, when every other tree on the block had already gone orange and red, this one was still mostly green, a few yellow leaves at the edges, stubbornly late. By November, it was brilliant, deep red, the richest color on the block. By December, it was bare. I watched it every time I came and went from the building. I thought about lateness, about how some things take longer to turn, about whether that is a comfort or just a fact. I did not resolve that question, I still have not. The notebook is almost full now. I have started a second one, same brand, black hardback. I date the entries, but I do not always note the year, which means sometimes when I go back I have to calculate from context. This is not a mistake. I think I do it on purpose without quite deciding to, because I want the notebook to be less about chronology and more about things themselves, the incidents and the thoughts and the trees. I wrote about Ruth in the second notebook. I have never met Ruth. I do not know if she is still alive. I know she was a nurse at Piedmont Hospital in Atlanta in 1998, and she held an old woman's hand all night, and the old woman was Patricia Dewberry's mother, and Patricia Dewberry told Malcolm Dewberry, and Malcolm Dewberry sat in a vinyl chair in my hospital room, and Patricia Dewberry started a scholarship, and I applied to the Emory program, and I became a family nurse practitioner, and I work in East Point, and every day I stay in the rooms a little longer than I have to. Ruth does not know any of this. She held a hand in 1998 and went home and made coffee or watched television or whatever she did that morning after her shift, and she has no idea what happened next. The thread went on without her knowing. This is what I think about when I think about the work, not the recognition, because recognition is unreliable and arrives or doesn't for reasons that have nothing to do with what you actually did. But the thread, the thing you pass forward into people who will pass it forward into people you will never meet. My mother made me from scratch. Whatever her limitations, whatever the ways she flattened me and redirected me and explained away my sweet potato pie, she also made me. She worked for Patris Eldridge on the north side with her good shoes and her tone that said this is beneath me, and she paid the Pell Grant Gap, and she was there in the delivery room, and she prayed over my head when I was sick as a child, and she has her version of loving me which is real and limited and insufficient and real. I carry this the way I carry everything, with both hands, not lightly. My father said you always were good at whatever you did. During a commercial in November 2017, he said the truest thing he knew how to say. I carry that too. And I carry Malcolm in the vinyl chair, and Patricia's hand on mine at the lunch indicator, and Gerald saying you are the patient right now, and Sonia at triage who saw through my 8 that I was calling 6. I carry the card. It is in the drawer. Every time I pull it opens. The bill is handled. That is the whole story. One more thing, I want to tell you about the moment I drove back to my apartment on Tuesday morning after discharge. It was early October light, the particular Atlanta October light that is cleaner than summer light, less hazy, more direct, and I drove down Ponce de Leon and I passed the Jamaican restaurant, and I passed the coffee place where Malcolm had gotten the yogurt and granola, and I drove to my building and I parked and I sat in the car. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my building for maybe 15 minutes. The engine was off. The light came in at an angle through the windshield and made a strip of warmth across the steering wheel. I put my hands on the steering wheel and I sat. I thought about the room I had just left, the drop ceiling, the holes in the tiles, the parking structure with its ordinary traffic, the vinyl chair pushed back against the wall. I thought about what had happened in that room and what had not happened. I thought about my mother's blue dress and her good earrings and the slightly too large expression of concern. I thought about my father with his elbows on his knees looking at the IV stand. I thought about Malcolm and the styrofoam container and him reading his phone by the window and not making the eating into a thing. I thought about the card on the tray table while I was sleeping. He had not waited for me to wake up so he could see my reaction. He had put the card down and left. He had not needed to see my face. That detail, that specific detail, he had not needed to see my face. I sat in the car and I breathed and I thought about what it means to do something for someone without needing to see their face when they find out, without needing the confirmation, without needing anything back. That is the version of love I had been looking for my whole life, the kind that does not need the face, the kind that puts the card on the table and goes. My parents needed the face. They needed me to be grateful in a visible way, needed my need to be visible in a specific way, needed the whole transaction to proceed in the way they recognized a transaction. And when my need did not fit their recognition of what need should look like, they adjusted their schedule instead of coming. I am not angry at them. I want to say that one more time. The anger was there early in my 20s, a hot, tight thing in my chest that I carried for a few years and then put down, not because I resolved it, but because anger at people who are doing what they are capable of is like being angry at the rain. It is weather, it is what it is. What I feel now sitting in that car in my memory, what I feel now telling you this, is something more like a clear-eyed acknowledgement. They are who they are, I am who I am. Malcolm Dewberry walked into the wrong room at the right time, and his wife started a scholarship for a nurse she never met, and I am a family nurse practitioner in East Point, and I stay in the rooms a little longer. The thread is long. I got out of the car, I took my bags, the one with the card in it, and I walked up to my apartment and I unlocked the door and I went inside. My apartment was exactly as I had left it 5 days before, which is to say neat and quiet and mine. The cup I had been drinking from Tuesday morning was still on the counter, washed and turned upside down to dry. The laptop was on the kitchen table. The half-finished application was on the laptop. I set my bag down. I put the card in the kitchen drawer, the one that sticks a little. I made tea. I opened the laptop. I finished the application 6 weeks later. That is the whole story.